All ships prepare to move away from Tarsonis on my mark.
Over the history of gaming, a number of genres have enjoyed massive spikes in their popularity, only to go on to lose it just as quickly. Some of these have tried to reinvent themselves, making dramatic changes in order to remain relevant, whereas other genres seem to have died off almost entirely, or some have become the domain of indie developers. Over the years, the way we interact with and consume our gaming content has changed dramatically, even in something as fundamental as how we control the action. Technological advancements such as new and improved input devices, or the proliferation of high-speed internet, have led to a permanent change in gaming habits. In the mid-1990s, real-time strategy definitely enjoyed that golden age of popularity. Other than a few memorable bright spots such as Warcraft 3, Supreme Commander, and the release of StarCraft 2, what has followed could be described as a gradual decline for the genre. Considering all the technological advancements and the changing consumer habits, it really does beg the question whether RTS can say it's done enough to innovate and remain relevant. This is a challenge which has faced all genres over the years, and I think we can take some lessons from the more notable examples, such as the downfall of adventure games and platformers, or the evolution and reinvention of the first-person shooter. First-person shooter games have changed radically over the years, and have pushed innovation every step of the way. Early titles such as Wolfenstein 3D and Doom already innovated in terms of the way they were distributed. The early chapters of these games were distributed via shareware. Essentially, they were free to play and to share amongst your peers. In part thanks to this model, and in large part thanks to the incredible quality of the games themselves, they were smash hits, shared far and wide, and many people went on to buy the full game. Such was the overwhelming dominance of Doom and Doom 2, that for several years, when people looked to play a first-person shooter game, what they searched for is Doom clone. For a time it looked like the genre may just be a passing fad, its fortunes tied to the success of id Software's upcoming title Quake. And while Quake did go on to massive success, it was not alone in this regard. It was joined by titles such as GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64, showing the genre had appeal across different platforms and different control devices. As console controllers started to incorporate analog control sticks, and PC pointers improved, eventually culminating in optical sensors, the FPS genre was quick to capitalize and really make the most of these developments. Another development was the proliferation of dedicated GPUs or graphics cards for home computers, allowing computer games to be far more ambitious in terms of using 3D imagery. From day one, first-person shooters have been at the cutting edge in terms of 3D graphics, often used as benchmark tools when people want to test out the strength of their computer. When FPS games are constantly pushing the envelope in terms of graphical fidelity, it's very hard for the genre to truly lose relevance or die out completely. FPS developers such as id Software have also been at the forefront of creating new games engines, which are then licensed by other developers to create their own titles. You can see this heritage through to today. When you think of the Unreal engine from Epic Games, the original Unreal was a 1998 first-person shooter, and they created the first version of the Unreal Engine, which today is in its 5th iteration and is used by many developers across the world. With wide access to powerful game engines such as the Quake engine around the turn of the century, there was an explosion of first-person shooter development, and we got some magical titles such as Half-Life, initially based on the Quake engine. Around this time, internet infrastructure was improving rapidly, with a number of countries enjoying widespread broadband coverage. There was also a fledgling LAN scene in some countries, with people physically gathering to play networked games against each other on low latency. FPS titles were quick to take advantage of this emerging technology. Quake and its sequels focused heavily on 1 versus 1 arena multiplayer combat, with Quake 3 being exclusively a multiplayer title. The Half-Life mod Counter-Strike took a different approach, focusing on team-based missions and objectives. Not only was the genre enjoying a massive resurgence in popularity thanks to this multiplayer trend, but it was at the forefront of the underlying technology in terms of servers, data centers, and the netcode within the game engines. As the multiplayer trend was really gathering steam, other developers leaned heavily into the single-player experience, really focusing on storytelling and scripting, trying to create an immersive single-player experience for the gamer. I think this really peaked with the Medal of Honor game series, created by Steven Spielberg, with the aim of trying to bring a cinematic level of storytelling to the gaming world. So if you consider the genre just after the turn of the millennium, you have a very broad and diverse offering, which caters to a wide variety of different types of gamers. You have the cinematic single-player experiences which really try to immerse you in a story. You have the co-op or couch multiplayer console games using analog sticks, such as GoldenEye, or spiritual successors such as Time Splitters and Halo. Then you have the whole world of networked or internet PC multiplayer, arena shooters such as Quake, or team-based titles such as Counter-Strike, Day of Defeat. And this is all underpinned by the fact that FPS games tend to have the best graphics, the best engines, and they tend to make the most of emerging technologies. In the intervening years, gameplay-wise, I would say not too much has changed, other than perhaps the rise to prominence of survival battle royale style games such as DayZ and PUBG, where you play in massive battlegrounds. Typically you're one of 100 players competing. Over time, single-player storytelling has increasingly become the domain of the role-playing game, and FPS has become more focused on multiplayer, be it console or PC, and there's also a focus on professional competition, aka esports. Over time, the monetization model has also changed in the industry, with games sometimes now being free to play or paid for on a seasonal basis, and then developers make back their money through a series of microtransactions. These tend to be cosmetic in nature, such as customizing the way your character looks, the skin on the weapons you carry, or perhaps the animations that you have, or maybe your character does a particular celebratory dance. Considering you control a single character in-game, and you choose from a limited selection of weaponry, FPS games are ripe for this kind of monetization. Creating weapon skins in CSGO, for example, has been big business. Ultimately, I think the FPS genre is one which is characterized by massive spikes in popularity, but also supported by an enduring relevance thanks to its innovation and willingness to adopt new technologies and innovate with gameplay.
Take on the world.
Point-and-click adventure games were enjoying huge popularity in the early 90s, including high-profile movie tie-ins with games set in the Indiana Jones and Dune universes. These games were typically heavily story-driven and tended to involve an element of puzzle or problem-solving. These games would tend to play out like interactive stories, with the player taking on the role of the protagonist and interacting with a number of NPCs across various static backgrounds. These tended to be rich in detail and packed with various curiosities and Easter eggs. For the time, these adventure games marked the high watermark in terms of storytelling within computer games. They were often filled with smart and funny dialogue, even sometimes voice acted. Following this popularity in the early 90s, there was a gradual decline, and then things fell off a cliff edge. The term adventure game became deeply unfashionable with developers and with consumers. I think there are a few factors at play here. First of all, RPGs started to become the venue of choice for cinematic, story-driven titles. They began to cannibalize some of the audience which would typically play adventure games. These RPGs also boasted more interactive and dynamic gameplay mechanics. There was a feeling amongst adventure games that all of the puzzles, all of the tricks had kind of been played out already, and there was a sense of staleness. On the other side of things, adventure games were under threat from first-person shooters, which were making far better use of the growing graphical processing power on personal computers. For as intricate and charming to look at as the pre-rendered backdrops were in adventure games, they were really no match for fully 3D rendered, action-packed first-person shooter games. As you started to see more story-driven FPS games featuring scripted moments, such as Half-Life, it really became no contest. These games had far more dynamic gameplay, and they were able to tell a story to a serviceable degree. So really the genre was being pinched on two sides. The storytelling was being taken away by RPGs, and first-person shooters were offering more dynamic, action-packed gameplay. If you wanted to solve puzzles and problems, then there were standalone games focusing exclusively on that, rather than adventure games which were trying to do a little bit of each and not really excelling at any. It's not necessarily fair to say that the genre is completely dead. It does live on, but not in the same way that you know it. For example, survival horror can trace its roots back to adventure games. Games such as Alone in the Dark, when released, were considered adventure games, before later retroactively being classed as survival horror. and of course that heritage leads into games such as Resident Evil. Another subgenre which is kind of forked off from adventure games is the visual novel or interactive movie genre, which is still enjoying massive popularity, particularly in Japan. Although I think indie developers are creating the vast majority of these visual novel adventure games, there are some AAA studios such as Capcom, which are still putting out very well-known titles, such as the Ace Attorney series. So I think it's clear to see why the genre has struggled to keep up in terms of these big-ticket AAA game releases. But I think when it comes to small indie developers, there is some potential here. It is a good, low-cost, low-resource way to create your game, to tell your story, to create something compelling, and to build upon. In some ways, I think RTS is suffering a similar fate to adventure games. It's no longer the choice for ambitious cinematic storytelling. If you think back to the high watermark of StarCraft 2, that was released in 2010. Although nowhere near as deeply unfashionable as adventure games have become, RTS is certainly no longer a common choice amongst AAA developers. And when AAA RTS titles do get made, they tend to be very generic and derivative. There's absolutely no risk-taking or innovation going on. The genre also appears to have fallen behind in terms of technology, particularly graphics quality. There really is no competition when you try to compare real-time strategy titles to first-person shooters, action adventures, or even some action RPGs such as Elden Ring. I think this is partly a limitation of the genre itself. When you have so many different units on the screen which you're trying to control, a certain level of graphical clarity is required, and usually that means making things rather stylized or simplified. And this is definitely a detriment to the popularity of the genre, because some titles, regardless of how they play, are just sold on the quality of their graphics, their use of next-gen technology. And if you look at Stormgate, for example, despite being marketed as very much a competitive RTS, focusing on multiplayer gameplay, many fans are crying bitterly about the quality of the graphics or the style of the art design, so looks do matter. Another issue caused by the general busyness on screen when playing a frantic RTS game is the difficulty in implementing modern pricing models, such as microtransactions for cosmetic benefits such as skins. When there are upwards of 30 distinct units and buildings to construct, and perhaps hundreds of these fighting on screen at any given time, people will struggle to care about having a skin for one particular unit. I mean, who cares if your tank looks a bit different when it's one of 100? Also, when trying to focus on competitive, fair gameplay, skins quickly distort things, especially if you change any kind of animations and make spells or effects harder to see. When I look to the genre today, I see one which has had massive success in the past, but has essentially stagnated and is on a gradual decline. I think large publishers and development houses see the genre as a bit of a risk nowadays, and if they do bother taking a risk on RTS, they want to minimize that by milking some old IP. So what you'll see is remastered editions of games such as StarCraft, Warcraft, Command & Conquer, or if you see new titles within these IPs, they're very generic, derivative, taking no risks and minimizing development costs as much as possible, sometimes even outsourcing these titles. In the middle you have these kind of challenger development houses, a bit larger than indie, often making use of things such as Kickstarter to raise funds, and in my opinion some of them are trying to achieve the impossible. They're trying to replace StarCraft Brood War as the competitive RTS title, something which proved impossible even for Blizzard. So when I see titles such as Stormgate and Zero Space setting records for RTS Kickstarter campaigns, raising millions of dollars in funds, and then setting out their goal to replace StarCraft essentially, 1 versus 1 competitive multiplayer RTS, it sets alarm bells ringing, because I think it's an unrealistic target. And I also think that's not really the future for the genre. I also feel that each of these highly anticipated, heavily crowd-funded projects, which ends up in disappointment, is just another blow for the industry, for the genre, and I really think we need to get away from this obsession with trying to replace Brood War. Having said that, I also feel that epic cinematic storytelling is not necessarily the future of the genre either. We've seen that this is done better by action adventures and certainly by role-playing games. So it kind of begs the question, what remains for RTS? And I think the answer is gameplay. I also think the future probably lies with indie developers, those who are more willing to take chances and actually innovate with the gameplay mechanics. One area which I think has shown some promise is the idea of combining RTS with other genres, sometimes other strategy subgenres such as 4X. A recent release which has executed this extremely well is Sins of a Solar Empire 2. It's a hybrid of RTS and 4X elements set in space, although it's very loose in its 4X and can be played as a straight up RTS. Where I think there's huge potential is in the combination of first-person shooter and real-time strategy elements, and there are a couple of upcoming titles which are really showcasing the potential of this. Silica is a futuristic sci-fi RTS FPS hybrid, very reminiscent of the legendary Half-Life mod Natural Selection, pitting humans and aliens against each other on a giant battleground. Perhaps the most impressive looking and ambitious of them all is Total Conflict Resistance, which could be said to be combining 3 genres. You have grand-scale turn-based tactical elements, dealing with moving troops around, travel times, supply lines, everything like that. Then there is real-time strategy, where you're moving around specific groups of units in real time. And then there's a first-person shooter element where you can take control of individual units or groups of units and try to turn the tide of a particular battle. I think one of the really big appeals of combining genres in this manner, particularly first-person shooter, is that it allows RTS games to get back towards the cutting edge of graphical fidelity and take more advantage of emerging technologies. Rightly or wrongly, there's a large contingent of gamers who will only play games if they have cutting-edge, modern 3D graphics. Regardless of how highly regarded the gameplay might be, if the game doesn't look good, if it's not modern, if it's not in the latest technology, they just won't give it a chance. By combining RTS with more graphically intensive genres such as first-person shooter, it allows RTS to remain relevant. It also exposes a new audience to the gameplay of RTS and brings in new players. So to conclude with a few hot takes, I would say the future of RTS does not lie with AAA developers, nor does it lie with well-established franchises such as StarCraft, Warcraft, or Command & Conquer. I also don't think it lies with trying to replace StarCraft as the competitive esports 1 versus 1 title, and I feel projects which are trying to do that are setting themselves up for failure, including Stonegate and Zero Space. RTS is also no longer the venue of choice for epic cinematic storytelling, and nor should it be. It's expensive and takes a long time to develop, and other genres have established themselves as being able to do this far better, such as RPGs and action adventures. Where I think the potential and the future does lie is mainly with indie projects, games which are focusing on the gameplay, trying to innovate this, trying to introduce new mechanics and really drive the genre forward. The RTS projects which have excited me the most in recent years have all been of this nature. They've not been AAA projects and big, heavily anticipated titles that are heavily crowdfunded. They've been almost surprise indie projects, or games which hit early access and are extremely engaging to play almost immediately. I think we really need to end this cycle of shoveling epic amounts of money into Kickstarters for games which claim they will be the future competitive RTS title which will push aside StarCraft Brood War and become the gold standard for years to come. It's not realistic, it's disingenuous, and it's destroying goodwill between gamers and developers. I do think RTS has a future, and I think it does remain relevant as a genre. I just think that it needs to adapt, and is gradually doing so. The future is no longer AAA titles, storytelling, or competitive esports. It's much more smaller projects, indie studios, and gameplay enhancements. Get back to the basics. I recently made a video showcasing 19 upcoming RTS titles, all of which I think have the potential to help turn the genre around. I also did another video where I reviewed one of the recently released hybrid games, which combines 4X and RTS elements. I was extremely impressed. If you're interested in either of these videos, I put the links on the screen.